Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ben here, and today I'm going to be continuing with the second part of a four-part series that I've started about the NBA and the best teams throughout each decade in each conference. So in the first video, we covered the 1980s in both the Eastern and Western Conference, and I talked a bit about who the best teams were. So if you missed that video, go back and check that, because even though you can watch each of these as a standalone, it sort of helps you learn more about the franchises overall if you can see how their team progressed throughout the decades, which I think is interesting, and hopefully you do too. So I'm going to just review quickly again how I'm going to go through this process. So I did something where I created a point system for how far each team goes in the playoffs in a certain year. So I assigned 0 points for missing the playoffs, 1 for the second round, 2 for the semis, 3 for making a conference finals, 4 for making it to the finals, and 5 for winning a championship. So I assigned values to each team's playoff appearance based on that scoring system, and then gave them a composite score, which was the total of all those throughout the 1990s. The first season being 89 to 1990, and the last season being 1998 to 1999. I did it that way because even though 1989 gets in there and it's technically the 80s, most of the season was in 1990 and the playoffs were in 1990, so I'm going to count that as part of the 1990s. Alright, and so besides that, I also took the team's win total from each season for the 1990s and then divided them by 10, so I got an average win total per season to assist in figuring out which team was the best in the regular season over the decade. Also, in 1998 to 1999, there was a lockout, so they only played a 50-game season. But I just adjusted every team's win total for as if they played an 82-game season, just to make everything easier. And also, I didn't take every single team in the NBA. I just took about like the top 7 or 8 teams from each conference, because those are the ones that'd be making the playoffs, and that would be relevant for this conversation. So to start off with, I'm going to be covering the Eastern Conference first, because I think the Western Conference is really interesting for this decade, and I want to save that for the end. But starting off with the East, this decade was primarily dominated by the Bulls. They won 6 titles from 91 to 93 and 95 or 96 to 98. And in the years that they didn't make the finals, they lost in the second round in 94 and 95, and then in 1990 they lost in the conference finals. And in 99 they didn't make the playoffs, but besides that, they were basically the team to beat, and no one could ever beat them. So they owned this decade in the Eastern Conference, which I think we all knew beforehand, but just covering the bases here. Their average win total for all the 10 seasons combined was 57 wins a year, but that would have actually been quite a bit higher if the last year, 1998 through 1999, was not included, because that's the year where Scottie Pippen left, and Michael Jordan left, and Phil Jackson left, and Dennis Rodman left, and the team really just crumbled because all the major pieces and components of the championship dynasty left the team. And so if you don't include that season and just take the win totals divided by 9 instead of 10, they actually win an average of 61 games, which I think comes off as a lot more impressive than 57, because I feel like 57 is a lot more common for a decade for a really good team. But I think when you look at that 61, that really shows you how dominant they were on average throughout a 9-year stretch. But we have to include the last year, so they're only a 57 win team on average throughout the decade. Their playoff composite score is 37, which is very good. It's a result of them winning all the championships. It again could be much higher if they wouldn't have missed the playoffs in the year after Jordan went away and Pippen went away, but that's just the way it happened. So yeah, that's the Bulls. Moving on, we have the Knicks, who made the playoffs in every year of the 90s, making 2 finals appearances in 94 and 99. This was basically the Patrick Ewing era. He and a bunch of basically role players were always the Knicks team, and they were always very tough and played people really hard, and that's all you can really say about the Knicks of the 90s. They got bounced in the second round a lot. I'm looking down here. They got taken out in the second round 6 out of 10 years in the 90s, which is honestly sort of impressive that they did it that much, but they've got consistency at least. Their composite playoff score is 24, which is considerably lower than the Bulls, but still the second highest in the decade in the conference. Also, their average win total during the regular season was 50 wins, which is pretty impressive and also the second best in the conference. So they were clearly the runner-up, basically, for the East for the 1990s. Next, we have the Indiana Pacers, who made the playoffs every year in the 90s besides 1997, which I believe was the year that Reggie Miller was out the whole season. So that explains that. We often think of the Pacers as this kind of staple of the Eastern Conference with Reggie Miller, but they lost in the first round in 5 of those 10 years. So they weren't ever going deep, really. They made the conference finals in 4 of the years, but they kind of balanced out. People think that they were a dominant East team, but they really weren't, It seems like Reggie Miller can never really find the right combination. Their average win total for the 1990s was only 47 wins. The main reason that this isn't higher is because in those first 4 years of the 90s, when they were losing in the first round, every year they were either 42-40 or 41-41 or 40-42, like that. So that really brought down their average as far as win totals. But they were always in it, and they were sort of one of those teams like the Knicks, who were just waiting out Michael Jordan to be gone. And they did eventually get their shot, but we're going to talk about that in the 2000s video. So they were always there, but never really a threat to the Bulls, honestly, except for one year in 1998. They took them to 7 games in the Eastern Conference Finals, but I don't know if it was really them being that good or the Bulls just being that tired. So that's my opinion on that. Next is the Atlanta Hawks, who made the playoffs in every year except 2 of the 1990s. They never made it past the second round, though, and were always losing in either the second or first round. Their composite playoff score is 12, which isn't that great, but at least they had the consistency to make the playoffs. They were a lot like the Portland Trail Blazers that I talked about in the previous video, who seemed to lose in the first round every year. But at least you're there. At least you're got a chance to compete, which is more than a lot of teams can say. So that's impressive in my book. They had an average win total of 47. This is actually an interesting decade for the Hawks in that they were transitioning from the Dominique era to more of the Mookie Blaylock and Steve Smith era and Mutombo, but still they never had to hit the rebuild button, which I think is always an accomplishment, and it's very impressive, honestly. So that's all I have to say about the Hawks. Next, I have the Boston Celtics. They really weren't that good in the 90s, but I feel like just because it was the tail end of the McHale and Parrish and Larry Bird years, I had to put them on here. They made the playoffs in 5 of the 10 years, never getting past the second round, though. And they only had an average win total or average of 39 wins per season, which is below 500. But during the beginning of the decade, they did have a 59-win season and then one more maybe 61-win season, I want to say. But those were really early on, at the very tail end of Bird's prime. So that explains that. But besides that, they were not a very good team in the 90s. But I thought that they were worth mentioning just because it's the end of such a notable dynasty. Moving on from them, The next team to talk about is the Detroit Pistons, who I had to include because they won a title in 1990, and my rule is if a team wins a title in a decade, they automatically have to be on this list. But they made the playoffs enough times to qualify also being on. They made it in 6 out of 10 years, losing in the first round for most of those, but they were still a decent team. They got Grant Hill in the mid-90s, which really helped them improve. That's why they made the playoffs in 96, 97, and 99, really. He and a very aging Joe Dumars were the catalysts on those teams. And they had a playoff composite score of 12, which is all right, the same as the Hawks. You know, kind of like an always. Besides if you take out the championship year, they don't have a good playoff composite score at all. They're sort of like the Celtics in that they were the end of an era. But with the championship, it's a much more impressive decade. Their average win total was 43 wins, which is pretty decent. You know, it's good to be above 500, but it's sort of like a contrast in that they were really good at the beginning of the decade and then really bad at the end of it. So it's not like they were consistently a 43, 44 win team. It's like they went from really good to really bad, and then like meeting in the middle was their average win total of 43. So there you have that. Moving on to the Orlando Magic in the 1990s, who made the playoffs 5 times. Composite playoff score of 10, which is not that high, but I felt like they just had to be included because this was during the Shaquille O'Neal, Penny Hardaway era. And this is, I think, one of the best teams to never win a championship was the 1995 Magic with Dennis Scott and Nick Anderson and Horace Grant, as well as the aforementioned Shaq and Penny. You know, I'll probably do a video in the future about the best teams to never win a championship, or at least some of my favorites to never win a championship. And along with those same lines, you could argue that this Magic team of the 90s was sort of like a what-if type of dynasty scenario, where if Shaq stays in Orlando, they probably do win a title, but it's just a big what-if. Their average win total was 42 wins, which is pretty good considering that they were a bad team for about the first half of the 90s. They missed the playoffs in 90, 91, 92, 93. And then once Shaq got there, they finally did decent. He got there in 93, but they actually didn't make the playoffs that year. But after that, they did. And their average win total is like the Pistons in that half the years they were really good and half the years they were really bad. So their win total isn't like what the average team was. It was sort of like taking the middle ground of 2 ends of the spectrum as far as how their team performed. So yeah, that's the Eastern Conference. The Bulls thoroughly dominated. The Knicks and Pacers were like the clear-cut second best teams, and then you had a mix of like the rest just sort of meddling, doing okay. But probably like if you had to put the next team in the line, that'd be the Hawks, just because they were in the playoffs every year. And unlike the last 3 teams I talked about, they weren't like a end or start of a dynasty. They were just like consistent. So that's, you know, I think that's admirable, even if you don't win a championship, to be making the playoffs every year and have a winning record. Nothing to be ashamed of. So now I'm going to transition to the Western Conference, which I think of all of the different decades and different conferences that I'm going to talk about, this is probably the most talented group. So the interesting thing is every one of these teams that I'm going to now cover in the Western Conference, all of them at one point or another made it to the finals for the Western Conference in the 1990s, which I think is really rare. You had 7 different teams make the finals for the West, and the only ones to repeat appearances were the Rockets and the Jazz. So it was a very diverse decade with a lot of parity in the Western Conference, and just a high level of competition, and everyone just repeatedly playing each other in the playoffs and getting some really good rivalries. And let's start it off. So the first team I have to talk about is the Portland Trail Blazers. They are sort of like the Atlanta Hawks that I just talked about. They made the playoffs every year in the Western Conference in the 90s. Very successful in the early 90s. Between 90, 91, and 92, they got to the finals twice and the conference finals once, which is very impressive. And then a string of 6 straight years just losing the first round, which is a bit demoralizing, but also at least you're there. So that's something to hang your hat on. Their composite playoff score was 20, which is pretty good. It's not necessarily because they had a lot of success in the playoffs. It's just because they were there, like I just mentioned a minute ago. Their average win total in a season was 52, which is pretty good as well. They never got a title, but I'd still say that this was a successful era for the Trailblazers in that they were able to transition from the Clyde era in the first half of the 90s to the Rasheed Wallace era in the second half of the 90s, and they never had to miss the playoffs, which is impressive. So yeah, that's what I got for the Trailblazers. Moving on for the Lakers, they're a very interesting team in that they're a lot like those teams in the Eastern Conference I was talking about, where in one decade you see the end of a dynasty and the start of another, actually. And they did better than those other teams in the East because they didn't get really bad after their first dynasty ended. They actually had a very quick turnaround and performed very well in starting the new dynasty too. They only missed the playoffs once during the 1990s, and their average playoff wins during their average regular season wins was 51. Their composite playoff score was 18. They made the finals once. They had a pretty equal mix of losing the first round, the second round, the conference finals besides that. So just like a good, solid team. First half of the decade was Magic. Second half of the decade was Shaq and Kobe taking over. And they just did pretty good overall. And I think about as good as you could expect for a team transitioning from one dynasty to another. Moving on from them, I have the Supersonics next. They made the playoffs in 8 of the 10 years, made the finals in 96, made the conference finals in 93. Besides that, they were losing in the first or second round. A playoff composite score of 16, which is actually the lowest of all the teams on here in the Western Conference. So it's impressive that they made the finals and made the playoffs like every year, yet they're like the 5th or 6th best team in the Western Conference during this decade. I just think that in and of itself like testifies how strong the West was during this period. Their average win total during the regular season was 53, which is very good. It's actually the second highest of any team in the West during this decade. So you got to give their hat off to them for that. They had really good regular season success. And yeah, I think that they were a team where if I was trying to look for a modern comp to them, I always think of the Los Angeles Clippers with Chris Paul and Blake Griffin for a stretch there. The Supersonics played similar in that they had Gary Payton, who I think is like Chris Paul, and that he's a great defender and great at stealing the ball and can get points himself and also assist people. Chris Paul's probably a better dribbler and ball distributor, but Gary Payton is probably a way better defender. But still comparable. And then Shawn Kemp and Blake Griffin, I think, are almost the same player, just in different decades. And also the team makeup was similar in that both had surrounding shooting guards and good sixth men. And just a good supporting cast too. But I feel like both underachieved a little bit in that one year. The Sonics were the first seed in 94, and they actually lost in the first round. They lost to the 8th-seeded Nuggets with Mutombo, the first 8 seed to ever upset a 1 seed. So in that respect, they, like the modern-day Clippers, underachieved a bit. But, still a good stretch. You don't have to win a title to be a success in the NBA. Moving on from them, the next team we have is the Utah Jazz. The Jazz made the playoffs in every year in the 90s. A pretty diverse mix of playoff results. They lost in the first round 3 times, lost in the second round twice, made the conference finals 3 times, made the finals twice. So pretty wide range of results there. They had the highest composite playoff score of any team in the 90s during this decade, which was 24. And I think that can be attributed to the 3 trips to the conference finals, an additional 2 trips to the finals, and making the playoffs every year. It's hard to beat. So I'll get to this when I talk about the Rockets, but I think the big question I want to ask is, who had a more successful playoff run in the 90s, the Jazz or the Rockets? Because, well, I'll just save it for when I get to the Rockets and when I'm at the end of the video, actually. The Jazz had the highest average win total of any team in the Western Conference during the 90s. They had 57. So they had just a plethora of success during this decade with Stockton and Malone. The next team is the Spurs, who were always sort of in the mix, but a team that was getting bounced a lot early and never really made it that late until they broke through in 1999 and won the title with Duncan and Robinson. They were, besides that, basically losing in the first and second round every year, though. Their average win total was 52. And this team is really what I think of when I think of a stepping stone. Like in 95, it's supposed to be their year, and they were the stepping stone for Hakeem to get back to the finals and win the title. And in 93, they were the stepping stone for Barkley to get to the finals, and sort of his defining moment was he made this game-winning shot over David Robinson. And so I think, in a lot of respects, they were a stepping stone, and that might sound disrespectful, and it's not at all. To be a stepping stone, you have to be there in the big moments. You have to be able to make it to a certain point in the playoffs, and they did. So I respect them, but they just were what they were. I don't know if I mentioned it yet, but they had an average win total of 52 during the decade, which I think would have been a lot higher if David Robinson would not have missed an entire year with injury, because they only won about 20 games that year, so that brought down their average quite a bit. But at the same time, that lost season is what brought them Tim Duncan and the championship, so you can't really complain. Moving on from the Spurs, the next team I have is the Rockets, who won 2 titles during this decade, had a playoff composite score of 21, and had an average win total of 49. They only missed the playoffs 1 time. But besides the 2 championships, they made 1 conference finals when they had Barkley and Clyde in 97. But besides that, they basically lost in the first round most of the time. Second round twice, but first round 4 times. So they had a very mixed decade in that they were either like winning the championship or getting out in the first round. And an interesting thing about them too is that in the 93-94 season, they won 58 games, but for the rest of the decade, they were more like a 47-win team, I would say. That reflects in their average win total, I think, 49 wins on average, which is actually the worst of any teams on here, but they were the only team out of the Western Conference to win 2 titles during this decade. So were they the most successful? In a way, yes, but the least successful in the regular season. But the playoffs matter more, so they were the most successful team of the West in the 90s. But I think it really depends on how you look at it, too, because I think arguments can be made for other teams. And the final team I have is the Suns, who were good with Barkley in the early 90s and were basically just a first-round exit team in the second half of the 90s. They made the playoffs every year, which is impressive. They are they're the 3rd team to do that in this decade. So as you can tell, as I was saying at the beginning of talking about the Western Conference, a lot of consistency, a lot of the same teams playing each other, so a lot of good rivalries developed. How I was talking about Barkley and David Robinson. All of these teams, if you talk about them, basically all of them had some sort of rivalry with another. The Sonics and the Suns were a big rivalry. The Suns and the Rockets were a big rivalry. Rockets and Spurs because of the Texas thing. Rockets and Jazz, Jazz and Sonics, Blazers and everybody, because the Blazers beat everyone up, or got beat up by everyone, actually is what I meant to say, in the first round. But getting back to the Suns, they had an average win total of 52, playoff composite score of 18, which is tied for the second to worst, but still a good mark. They made the playoffs every year. And so I think that that's impressive. And as I said in my first video too, when I say that I think that's impressive that they make the playoffs every year, even if you don't win a championship, getting the playoffs and having a winning record is still good. Like, getting into the playoffs means that you were successful, you did what you had to do to at least get in and be competitive, and ultimately it puts more fans in the seats, generates more revenue, and is better for your team as a whole as far as dollars, even though some people think that may be a slimy businessman way of looking at it. It's the real world, so you gotta look, you have to be realistic in a lot of these scenarios, and making the playoffs is better than not making the playoffs. As for just a little miniature debate here, getting back to the Jazz and Rockets and who I think was more successful in the decade, I think that championships are great. Like, the Rockets had 2, and at the end of the day, people will rank Hakeem possibly higher than Karl Malone because of those 2 championships, and I think that's perfectly fine if they do that, because what you do in the biggest moments is what matters the most to some people. But I think that it shortchanges a player or a team when you only look at what happens in one moment of one game or the final moment of a game. I think that the complete body of work is also valuable to look at. And the Jazz, I would say, had a much more complete body of work than the Rockets did in the 90s. They had, on average, 8 more wins a season, 57-49. So they definitely excelled in the regular season a lot more. And even in the playoffs, the Rockets won 2 titles, but in the rest of the years, they were basically a first-round exit. Whereas the Jazz, in most of the years they were in the playoffs in the 90s, they were getting to the conference finals or the finals. Let's see here. In 5 of the 10 years, they got to the conference finals or finals. In the other years, there's a mix of losing the first and second round, but still, and they're close composite playoff scores too, 24-41. It's not like the Jazz had a way higher composite playoff score, but I don't think that's so cut and dry that if you win a championship, you automatically had a better dynasty. Like, for instance, let me think here. Well, actually, no, I'll get to that in another video. I can talk about this when I talk about the 2000s. But that's what I think about all this, guys. I think that the West in the 1990s was the best conference in any decade ever. You had every team doing good in the regular season, and these great rivalries between everybody in the playoffs everyone was constantly seeing each other, and it was the old familiar faces, and it was the wild, wild West. And the East was cool too, but it's just sort of like a foregone conclusion that the Bulls were always going to make it to the finals unless Michael wasn't playing for them. But this was a great decade for the NBA. I think it's really what catapulted it into the stratosphere as far as popularity. MJ did wonders for the game, and the West as a whole, which is so entertaining and exciting all the time, that it was a fantastic decade of basketball, and one of my favorites. I love going back and watching some of the old games, and if you guys have never done that, I highly suggest it. There are just some epic battles. If you watch finals, you're going to be watching a lot of Bulls stuff, and if you watch Western Conference playoffs, you'll get a whole bunch of different teams you can be looking at, and a whole bunch of different matchups between the group of teams that I was talking about today. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you learned a thing or two, and I hope you tune in for part 3 and part 4. And if you didn't get to watch part 1, you go back and learn a bit about the NBA in the 1980s. Okay, guys, I'll see you next time. Bye.